Hi everyone. It's working. And thank you for the intro, although I'm not sure I can agree that London is sunny. But anyway, thank you everyone for being here. And I'm Kitty, obviously. And I'm a director at Rari Labs, which supports Raremo Protocol. And we're basically working to make digital identities decentralized, user-owned and private, which might sound like a load of jargon, but hopefully by the end of this talk, it will make more sense. So I'm going to discuss Web3, and what I'm going to do is explain what it is, and then the technologies that support it, and I'll finish on a digital identity use case, which is my speciality. So to contextualize Web3, the internet has evolved in very distinct stages. So when it started, you had what's known as Web 1, and the internet back then was pretty much read only. So you could go on, you could read websites, but you couldn't really do anything. And it was very skeuomorphic. So it was almost like people just recognized the concept of a book and then imitated it. And you then had Web 2, which is where the internet became much more innovative and much more interactive, and you started being able to engage with it. So instead of just reading static pages, you could edit them, you could send emails, and this phase of the internet is referred to the read and write phase. So if Web 1 was read only, Web 2 was read and write. And then Web 3 will be read, write, and own. But to really make sense of that, I kind of want to highlight the problems that are endemic in Web 2. So as the internet became more interactive, it ironically also became more centralized. So famously, there are maybe 5 big tech corporations that own most of the internet and most of the data on the internet, including your own personal data. So, like Google, Amazon, Facebook. And this has spawned all types of issues. And there are kind of 3 key problems that I think the easiest way to understand them is really through social media. So the first problem is an economic problem, which is that you own the data and yet you don't profit from it at all. All of these companies get to monetize it. And there's that famous saying, which is if the product is free, you are the product. And that's very much the case with the current internet paradigm that we operate within. And the second big problem is an issue of privacy or surveillance. So again, because you don't own your data and these companies do, they're free to look into it, and they're also free, well, not necessarily free because there are penalties, but they are able to abuse it. So the most kind of well-known scandal associated with this was Cambridge Analytica, when they used social media data to influence electoral results. And then the third big issue is one that I always call the disempowerment issue, which is that because you don't own your data and you don't own your identifiers, you don't really own any part of your internet experience, you're very beholden on the people that do. So say, for example, you build a massive following on Facebook and this starts to be how you make your business, you then become dependent on Facebook for access to those customers. And you have very little leverage because you can't leave without forfeiting all of those customers. And this dynamic is so endemic, there's actually a term for it, which is the extract-attract dynamic, which is once a media platform has attracted you with a big enough network, it can then extract from you very freely. So you tend to get atrocious royalty frees on most internet sites, very little interoperability, and again, the sort of invasive data practices that I mentioned before and the surveillance one. This is kind of why Web3 is so urgently needed, and why it's so important that you do own your data and that you do own your identifiers and that you do own your digital assets more generally. And when you have that ownership, you can not only monetize your data and kind of sell it on to secondary parties. So in this sort of model, you would be selling your data to advertisers rather than a middleman selling it on for you. But you can also protect yourself from invasive surveillance practices and pick what you reveal about yourself. And also you can own very granular parts of your experience. So this one's a bit more complicated, but you could own, for example, the social graph that's associated with a media account, which would be the connections to all the followers, and you could transport it from one platform to another, and in doing so kind of redistribute the power balance between those platforms. So that is Web3. And then underpinning this promise of kind of like a decentralized, user-owned Web3 is blockchain. That is the core technology that would support it. And blockchain is often synonymized with crypto, which is understandable because cryptocurrencies were the very first use case for blockchain, and it was what blockchain was initially designed to support. So the kind of big launch of blockchain was the Bitcoin white paper in 2009. And the key promise of cryptocurrencies, like the key promise of Web3, was that these would be publicly owned, user-owned currencies. So not only are cryptocurrencies not maintained by a government or a central bank, they're also not like owned or held by an intermediary. So you own your own money. If it's a cryptocurrency, you would keep it in a wallet that you hold the keys to. And if you're doing a transaction, you would do it directly in what's called like a peer-to-peer transaction. And this sort of was born out of the 2008 financial crash. So like Bitcoin launched in 2009, like in a kind of landscape of like deep cynicism about like centralized control and the impact that that control can like have over the economy. So how blockchain actually works from a tech perspective is that it's at its core a digital ledger, a decentralized and like hyper-secure digital ledger. So it's a form of record keeping. And the reason it's called blockchain is because it's literally like a chain of blocks of data, and inside each block is what's known as a hash, which is like a cryptographic fingerprint that kind of identifies that block. And each block not only contains its own hash, but all of the hashes that came before it. So if you were to try like tamper with a block and tamper with some information, it would be immediately visible because you could see that that hash no longer fits the hashes like on either side of the blocks. That means that, to tamper with a block is very hard. And if you want to make a change to a blockchain, you have to have everyone using the blockchain network validate it. So these networks aren't maintained by one centralized organization. They're dispersed across like multiple computers. There's multiple people running them, and over 51% of the people in that network, over 51% of the computers would have to approve that a change is valid for it to be updated. And one of the really big kind of like technical innovations of Bitcoin and of blockchain was its kind of like game theoretic design. So there had been some experiments with these like consensus models and record keeping before, but the problem was that if you just got enough computers, you could seize control of the network and then start validating fake information. So what Satoshi and who launched the Bitcoin white paper did was came up with something called proof of work, which was basically that there was a computational cost for validating data on the blockchain. So this meant that if you wanted to pose as 1,000 people, you had to do the work of 1,000 people, and you had to pay 1,000 times more the price. So it becomes very, very like economically difficult to overthrow like a decentralized blockchain network. This means that the terms inside of a network are very, very hard to change. So for example, with cryptocurrency, part of the reason that the currency has value from like a financial perspective is that, or not from a cryptocurrency, from Bitcoin specifically, part of the reason Bitcoin has value is that it's encoded into the Bitcoin network that there will only ever be like 21 million Bitcoins. So there's a finite supply, and there's no incentive for anyone using the blockchain to, validate a change to that code because Bitcoin would lose its value. So it's a very, like the innovations within blockchain and Web3, they're not just technical, they're very game theoretic, which I always find very interesting. But anyway, so that's sort of blockchain and cryptocurrency, which is the first use case for these like decentralized digital forms of ownership. And that was, I think a pretty stunning first use case. But then in 2014, Ethereum launched, and Ethereum introduced something called programmable smart contracts. And this revolutionized the capabilities of the blockchain. So like previously with Bitcoin, the blockchain had largely been limited to sort of very good record keeping. And what Ethereum allowed was much more interactive products to be built on top of the blockchain. And so you really opened the path for more like dynamic use cases that really reflect the products that we're used to in Web 2, and all sorts of new like token standards and infrastructure was born out of this. So one of the most like famous ones that most of you have heard of is NFTs. NFTs are also, you know, famously very conflated with artworks, but they're not artworks, they're digital certificates. And the kind of innovation behind them, the thing that makes them significant, is that they are non-fungible. That's what the N and the F in an NFT stands for. And this means that they're completely unique and they're not interchangeable. So whereas with cryptocurrency, each coin, each piece of Bitcoin is interchangeable, they're all worth the same. An NFT like represents ownership over a very, very like specific asset. And the reason it got assimilated with art is because art as a unique asset needed a unique type of certificate to go with it. So if you owned a piece of digital artwork, you could prove through the certificate that it was the only one rather than one of many replicas. And this has really, you know, expanded what you can own on the internet. And one of the many things that NFTs allow users to help own is their online digital identities and their identifiers. So this is where I think we get to, like, the real crux of Web3 and like the reason I'm so excited about it and what I work on, which is like digital identity. And I think digital identity often sounds very amorphous, and that's because it is, because almost everything that you do online that's interactive requires an identifier. So if you're like sending a message on social media, or if you're ordering clothes online, like in every single use case, you'll need to have a login or a handle or a username, even if it's pseudonymous, or a bank account. Like there's so many identity artifacts that all get mingled in, and you don't own any of them. All of them are owned by banks or governments or centralized organizations. And, you know, like I already spoke earlier in the talk about kind of some of the more familiar risks that we have around that. But actually, like, I think the biggest and most like existential risk, and we don't have to think about it too often in the West because by and large we do trust our governments, but is the kind of surveillance and like persecution risk that is encoded into that dynamic and that you see playing out in parts of the world where there's regimes or autocracies. So, for example, just to backtrack a little bit, is again, because if you don't own your identifier, the person who does own it can control how the identifier is used, what it has access to, and they can also view everything you've ever done with it. So, for example, in China, you have a social credit system where if you have any debt at all, the identifiers that you use online are restricted by the government. So you can't book plane tickets, you can't book train tickets, your movement gets restricted, you're penalized in all kinds of ways, and it's all through the control of digital identifiers. So yeah, it's incredibly pernicious. And the kind of risks associated with identifiers are set to escalate because with the advent of AI, it's getting increasingly hard to tell what entities and what content is human generated and what's machine generated. So I'm sure lots of you are already familiar with like the problems with deep fakes and some of the like scandals that have unfolded as a result of this. Like, for example, I think one of the spookiest ones was this fake image of the Pentagon that went viral, a fake image of the Pentagon blowing up that went viral. And it caused the S&P to drop by, I think, 0.2% before it was identified as AI. And if this sort of like continues, then a lot of the things that we really value the internet for, which is like the reliable exchange of information and so forth, will be really affected. And the most likely solution, and we're already starting to see this arise, is tagging content and tagging accounts with identifiers that allow you to trace whether or not that content or that account came from a human or an AI, which like sounds quite, sounds quite innocuous, but the worst case scenario is that you can see who's generated every piece of content ever, which is good for provenance, but very, very bad for privacy, very good for anything you want to do that's personal online. And so with this sort of like infrastructure solution looming, were confronted, I think, as a society with two questions, which is like, who do we want to control this infrastructure? Like, do you want a centralized body to control it, like a government or a corporation, or do you want like a public good to control it? And then the second question is like, how do we encode privacy into this kind of content tagging so that you can prove that things are human, but you don't have to say exactly which human generated them, you don't have to show where the human lived, all of these other things. And I also want to just emphasize, in case I sound like a conspiracy theorist, that my fear isn't that like governments are going to seize control of this architecture, just that it won't be done in a way that restores or maintains like ownership and privacy for individual users, like regardless of whoever's generating this infrastructure. And this is where blockchain and blockchain-based artifacts come in, because blockchain is a kind of like intrinsic anecdote to AI in many ways. Like if AI is making the world less trustworthy, making the internet less trustworthy, blockchain can make it more trustworthy because of the properties that I outlined before. So that kind of immutability, the difficulty with changing data, the fact that everyone can publicly view what's on a ledger, and also, that everything's tamper-proof. And in the past couple of years, there's been a new type of cryptography that's emerged called zero-knowledge cryptography. And this has really amplified the capabilities of blockchain. So the kind of USP of zero-knowledge cryptography and what makes it so special is that it allows you to prove that a certain statement is true without revealing any other personal information. So for example, like the typical sort of study of this is you could prove that you're over 18 without revealing your birthday. Or if you use, say, a driving license to prove that information, you wouldn't have to include any of the data on the driving license. Like you'd have to reveal your address, your name, anything. So you can have like absolutely irrefutable confirmation of something and limit it to the only thing that needs to be known. So for example, with content tagging, you could limit it to like, this person is a human. They own a birth certificate. This birth certificate's used to stamp this content. We can't see who generated it or where they live. And this is a lot of what I work on is products that combine blockchain and zero-knowledge technology in order to make digital identity like safer and stronger and more in the hands of users. So the product or like the solution we built that I'm like most proud of and that we actually just launched last week is called Freedom Tool. And Freedom Tool was built to help people who are living in autocracies conduct surveillance-free polling and voting and other sorts of like electoral procedures. So there's been like a long-standing, challenge with digital elections around how do you identify people and confirm that they're eligible to vote, whilst also guaranteeing their anonymity and making sure they don't fall vulnerable to tracking and particularly state tracking if they're living in an autocracy, like in the process. And there previously hasn't really been a robust way to do it. And Freedom Tool solved this challenge. So how it works is you, it was used in England or whatever, you would take your UK passport or whatever passport you have, and you would use your phone to scan it, and there's a chip inside the passport. And applications built on Freedom Tool can verify the data in the passport. They can confirm that it was authenticated and released by a government. They can confirm that you're over the age of 18, and it then generates an anonymous voting pass. And we use zero-knowledge cryptography to sever the link between the passport scan and the pass itself, so that your scan and your voting pass can never be connected. And the scan itself never leaves your phone. All of that cryptography is generated by your own phone. So the scan is never entered into a server where it can be intercepted. Like the scan can't be recovered or used to trace either. It's completely untrackable. And then once you vote using voting passes generated by Freedom Tool, the vote is published directly onto the blockchain. So all of the results, again, are tamper-proof. Like they're very invulnerable to accusations that they're false or anything like that. And it's an open source solution, which means that anyone in any part of the world can use it to build. And part of the sort of beauty of it, I think anyway, is that it also allows the citizens or community setting up the apps to define the terms on the poll, or if they're using it as a kind of proxy election tool. So for example, if you're living in a region where certain minority groups are excluded from voting, you can include them and define them as eligible, and you can also include candidates who might have been excluded from the ballot. So the idea is often not to replace the official elections, which is not realistic in a lot of the places that we're using, but to provide very reliable polling and help activists organize and just provide like a voice for people who might be otherwise silenced. And this is actually one of the first times I'm publicly announcing this, but we've just had it confirmed it's going to be used in Russia, and it's going to launch in a couple of weeks as a means for people who are dissenting to register their opinion for the opposition. And I can't talk too much about the details, but it's been built and launched by opposition leaders like in Russia, and hopefully will like provide a way for Russians to just register that they don't support Putin or the only other candidate that Putin has allowed on the ballot. So I'm really proud of it. Thank you guys. And I hope that use case that I just described of freedom tools kind of illustrates why ownership over digital identities is so important, because I think like from the outset it does sound like very vague and very esoteric, but particularly in parts of the world where we don't have the freedoms we do here, it's really, really, like I think it's really important, and that the internet like desperately needs it, particularly as tech continues to grow. So that is the end of my speech.